Men, we live in a society divided by many things such as religion, politics, lifestyle choices, ethnicity, demographics, etc., etc., etc. But how should the man who follows Jesus interact with people who view life through different lenses than himself? Today I interview bridge building expert Curtis Chang about how the godly man can build bridges with those who have polarized viewpoints instead of burning those bridges. You're going to walk away with Jesus' perspective and methods for engaging in relationships with people who are different than you. Hey, today I'm excited to bring on my guest, Curtis Chang. Curtis is a theologian and faculty member of Duke Divinity School, as well as a senior fellow at Fuller Theological Seminary. Curtis has written for the New York Times and Christianity Today and has appeared on many top-level radio programs. He's also the host of the Good Faith podcast and author of his newest book, The After Party Toward Better Christian Politics. Yes, guys, we're going there today. This book is intended to help Christians navigate political conversations and rebuild strained relationships, especially as we enter another contentious election season. This, my friends, is the topic. Hey, I'm excited today to have my new friend Curtis Chang on the podcast. Curtis, it is great to have you on the show. How you doing, man?
I'm doing great. Thank you for having me on the show. I really appreciate it.
Well, you know, we get a lot of books pushed our way through publishers and publicists. And this one is different than no other book I've ever come across in our little circle here. But it's a huge topic. When I go to churches, I'm constantly having to call men out on this particular topic. And so I'm excited about this book, The After Party. Will you tell us a little bit about your personal story and then move into the after party and why you wrote the book?
Yeah, I wrote the book. So I'm a former senior pastor of an evangelical covenant church in California, in San Jose. And it's a church that I would say 15 years ago, we had a healthy mix of folks from the right and from the left, Republican and Democrat. Being in the Bay Area, I would say the majority were Democrats and more on the sort of, blue side, but it was a mix. And then in the last 15 years, we have gradually lost that mix, that people have sorted themselves out. And sadly, really tragically, I would say the conservatives, that of people who are my friends, who I've been their pastor and known them for years, I felt like they couldn't stay as part of the church. And it really wasn't ultimately anything I would say that was ultimately preached from the church. It was just the sense of like, it's more what wasn't preached from the church. It was like, hey, you're not sending the messages that I agree with politically, that I want to hear. And they just felt like they couldn't belong. And so I feel like that's a great tragedy that I think is not, and I would not say it is just their fault, the people who left. I think it is the fault of how we as Christians have prioritized partisan allegiances over Jesus, over unity in Jesus. And so I've experienced that, and I've explained the tragedy and the pain of lost relationships. And I'm not alone, Jim, that Christians throughout America at Thanksgiving and over Christmas in their social media feeds, we are sorting out, we are disappearing each other, we are canceling each other by partisan divides. And I think Jesus weeps over that.
Yeah, I agree 100%. You had a couple terms in your book that I'd never heard before, and one of them you've said twice now. So why don't you talk to us about this phrase, the big sort, and what it means?
The big sort is the reality that a broader cultural and demographic shift has happened in the last 30, 40 years and is accelerating. And the big sort's coined by a journalist called Bill Bishop that basically just shows that increasingly we are choosing to live, even just geographically, as well as in our social media worlds, but just even geographically, we're sorting ourselves out by partisan divides, such that living in communities where there is genuine difference and diversity in political opinion is getting harder and harder to do. And people are choosing to opt out of that more and more, such that most people now are living in communities where it's very hard to find somebody that, just as a neighbor, as a fellow parent in a school association, who has meaningful political differences than you are. And when that happens, something happens to our hearts and minds, because when we are surrounded by only people who think like us in a partisan way, There's a psychological dynamic called the law of in-group polarization. That's a lot of words to simply say when we get into a bubble, that bubble expands and gets harder and harder to escape. We reinforce each other's views, and we actually get more and more extreme in our views when we are only surrounded by people who think like us. This has been well documented in countless studies and experiments. And so this explains why we as a country, tragically, we are growing further and further apart. Is because we are sorting ourselves socially into our own political partisan bubbles, and that's actually pushing us further and further apart from each other.
Man, that is so true. The guy that led me to the Lord is always saying it's about Jesus, period, not Jesus plus. And
Hmm.
it's interesting. So I moved from California to Oregon, from a beach town in California to Oregon for economic reasons and because God called me to a church. But it's really interesting. I cannot tell you how many people I know, Christians, who are leaving Oregon and California, moving to red states.
Right.
These are the people I know personally,
Yeah.
because they can't handle the politics. Instead, they're moving to places where they're around like-minded people. And I never
Yeah.
can pronounce this word right, but tell me the danger of homogeneity.
Yeah.
Told you.
Homogeneous homogeneity.
I know.
Yeah,
Yeah, that's a
yeah, that's
problem in the church,
so
right?
exactly. It's the danger when we are surrounded only by people like us. And so we come to think that's reality, right? Think about after the election of 2016 or 2020, you had so many people on both sides disbelieving the results, right? So, like in 2016, when Trump won, like in my bubble, like in the Bay Area, people were like, how could this happen? I don't know anybody that voted for Trump. Or when Biden wins in 2020, you go to a red state, they're like, how could this happen? I don't know anybody that voted for it. So we lose sense of even what is reasonable, what is real, because we're not exposed to people at a relational level. And that's sad in terms of the formation of our hearts and minds as citizens, but it's really tragic when we're talking about the formation of our souls as Christians, as Jesus followers, because we start thinking then again, if we are only surrounded by Christians who are of our political color, our political stripe, we start merging that. We start merging Jesus with our partisan colors and thinking to be a follower of Jesus, of course, means you're a Republican, or in my world, of course, if to be a follower of Jesus means you're a Democrat, which is just totally antithetical to the actual claim of Jesus that he is Lord above all of these humanly constructed allegiances. But we start even unthinkingly and unconsciously absorbing partisan colors into Jesus.
It's interesting. Somebody just wrote a review about our podcast and said, I love Jim and the Men in the Arena podcast. They're politically incorrect, but biblically accurate. And I thought, well, I really don't think about politics when I speak about the Bible, because the Bible itself is divisive already, in the fact that Jesus, the gate is narrow, right? That
Yeah.
leads to Jesus, and the gate is broad that leads away from Christ. So the problem, here's the thing that I want believers, the men listening, listen to this. The church is supposed to be the most diverse people group on the planet. I believe it is the most diverse people group on the planet. So
Yeah.
what's the problem? These homogenous relationships make life easier, but how does this affect us spiritually as the
Yeah.
diverse, beautiful, collaborative body of Christ?
Well, it affects us because we start, like I said, conflating Jesus with a particular partisan color, right?
Yeah.
And that is a diminution. That's a lessening of the lordship of Jesus that actually should transcend partisan allegiances. Now, Jim, I think we need to define our terms.
Yes.
You'll notice I'm saying partisan a lot.
Yes.
I'm not saying political because there's a difference between those two things. And the problem is we've again conflated those two things. Political just simply means, hey, how are we going to live together? How are we going to live together? Like this is polis. That's where the word political comes from the Greek term, the community. It just means like, hey, we're going to have to live together. How are we going to do that? Anything that's talking about how we're going to live together, especially across differences, is political. So I am not saying Christianity has nothing to say about political, properly defined, because Christianity, for instance, our second greatest commandment is love your neighbor as yourself. That's talking about how we're going to live together as neighbors. And that's a political question. That is different than a partisan question. A partisan question, it reduces everything about politics to which team are you on, red or blue, Democrat or Republican. And that's different than talking about how do we live together as neighbors across differences. When we start adopting the mindset, I'm on a team, my job is to make sure my team wins and defeats the other team, and in all things. Um, so what I'm saying is let's prioritize Jesus and his view of what it means to live together as neighbors, right? Even across differences, which is political. It has political ramifications. So I'm not saying the Bible has nothing to say to politics. I'm saying you can't reduce the Bible to partisan loyalty and to partisan animosity, where one side is always and completely right and the other side is evil and wrong, and therefore we need to vanquish the other side. That I think is the danger when we reduce Jesus to partisan loyalty.
Now, so if we take partisan loyalty and we set it aside, would you also agree then that there is a polarization in society between the haves and the have-nots, between the different ethnicities, between sexual deviation and biblical norm? You know what I mean? There's also this is beyond politics. This is about polarization, right? How do we live with people that are different?
It's the increasing inability for us to live as neighbors.
Yes.
And to live and love. Which again is actually, it's not just tolerate, which is great. It's important to tolerate, but the Christians are called, the followers of Jesus are called to a higher standard
for sure
than just toleration. We're called to love,
Yep.
Which, by the way, does not mean agreement. This is not a simple like, oh, let's just all agree on the same thing, because we don't agree on the same things, and especially on some important issues we don't agree. It is possible to disagree and love your neighbor. And that's the key thing. And Jesus himself embodied that, right? Because Jesus himself was about reconciling humanity from God, who were polarized. We were enemies. We were aliens, as Paul says, from God. And Jesus says, hey, my job is to bring about a reconciliation, which does not mean, I hope all of our listeners agree, that we always agree with God, right? Or God agrees with us. Like, let's face it, many times we are living our lives as Christians in disagreement, even secretly or unconsciously. We are living in disagreement with God. Does that mean that God can't accept us, or that God can't love us, or that we can't love God even amidst disagreement? I think Jesus' whole death and resurrection is to show that the love of God is more powerful than disagreement, that his love can actually overcome the divisive power of disagreeing on things, such that there is an actual unity among differences. And so our imaging, because that's what we are meant to be, we're image bearers of God. In our relationships with one another, we should be imaging what God has done with us through Jesus, a love, a relationship of acceptance, even amidst disagreement, even amidst things that need to get worked out and may take a long time to get worked out. But that is the love of God, right? That love is actually, the love of God is more powerful than specific disagreements on issues. So if we are supposed to image that love in our relationships with one another, then in this day and age, one of the primary ways we can do that is how, as Christians, do we love one another even amidst real differences on specific issues?
You know, gosh, this is so fun for me because you're saying things that are just triggering great ideas. And I'm going to just share a couple things. So, you know, you talk about loving your neighbor as a second of the great commandments, but Jesus also said to love our enemies. So it seems to me, especially when I read the household codes in Ephesians 5, where men are told to love 4 different times, and that God doesn't ask us to do the easy thing. He asks us to do the hard thing, to love those who are different than us, even if they're our neighbor, even if they're our enemy. And the other thing that you triggered in me is you said we're image bearers, and I went back to 2 Corinthians 5 verses 19 to 21, that we are ambassadors. So we are the ones in between eternity and non-believers. I know that we have a lot of differences within the church, but I'm thinking about my neighbors, right? I've got some believers, some who aren't, and it's our job to bridge that gap. Yeah. So let's do this. Let's bridge that gap. Let's talk about Jesus and the way he chose his disciples. Did
Yes.
they represent a partisan viewpoint, or were they? Let's talk about the diversity or the homogeneity. I can't never pronounce that word.
Homogeneity. That's all right. No,
Homogeneity. I'll tell you what,
sameness.
man.
Let's just say sameness. How about
Same.
that?
That's just too easy. I like a challenge. But let's talk about Jesus. How did he do it, and why did he do it?
Yeah. Well, this is one of the things that I think is so important for Christians to realize is that Jesus formed his community, his party of disciples, right? The Jesus party of disciples amidst a period of great political polarization. That in Jesus' day, the central political question was, what do we do about Rome?
Yep.
Because it was a Roman imperial rule over Israel, and there were people who were cooperating with Rome and people who were opposing Rome
Mm-hmm.
very vehemently. And two embodiments of that, two sides. This would be the red and blue version of
Oh,
first
you know
century
it.
Israel. Okay. Would be a tax collector versus a zealot, right? A tax collector is somebody who's cooperating with Rome. They are collecting taxes for this oppressive regime against their own people, right? So you could imagine how if you were a Jewish nationalist, you're like, oh, you total sellout, you
For
tax
sure.
collector, right? And who are the ultra Jewish nationalists? They're the zealots, the zealot party. They are the political movement that wanted to defeat Rome using oftentimes military means,
Yep.
right? So what people don't realize is when Jesus picked his disciples, he deliberately picked somebody from both sides, right? In his disciples, we see identified is Simon the zealot, Matthew the tax collector, Matthew
Oh,
11,
yeah, for sure.
right? So everybody else, interestingly, if you look at that passage, everybody else is identified by the classic identity markers of Jewish first century society, the son of so and so, the son of so and so. Simon and Matthew are identified differently. And I think it's for exactly the reasons we're talking about. They're identified as, hey, Jesus and the scripture is telling us Jesus deliberately picked somebody from the two opposite sides of the most politically polarized issue of their day, a tax collector and zealot, and they were part of the original 12, the Jesus party that began all of this. What does that tell you about how Jesus is saying is the relationship between his rulership, his kingdom, and the kingdoms of the world, right? He's declaring by his very selection, my kingdom is transcendent, is the Lord over all of these specific partisan divides, right? And so that, and they hung together. Jesus formed and taught them in a way that Simon and Matthew could hang together in the same party, even after his death. They hung together as the Jesus party, which became known as the Christians, the Christian church, right? So that's the model for us today is, can we be the disciples of Jesus? Can we be the Jesus party, right? Which clearly means even on the most polarizing issues, red and blue, right? Zealot and tax collector, we hang together. We hang together because we are actually have a higher allegiance than the allegiances that contemporary current day politics want to pull us apart into.
Well, and even social media is grouping people in and separating them. So
That's
now it
right.
gets to the point you only see the things that you believe almost.
That's
And
right.
it's really interesting. So I had to laugh when you're talking because he did put them together, but he didn't partner them. So he made sure Simon was not partnered with Matthew, but they were part of the 12, but not he was not his partner. And but I thought that was funny. Another thing that I thought, and in John chapter 4, we see some prejudice of the day as well, and we see them going from Judea to Galilee, and John records, one of the sons of thunder, right? He says,
Yeah,
"Oh, Jesus had to go through Samaria." Man, they
that's
did
right.
not want to do it. There
Yeah,
was a lot of not only political bias, but there were also ethnic bias.
that's right.
So it's
That's
really
right.
so I want to get to the heart of your book, and I want you to just really just dumb this down and explain this. You say something I think is very powerful in your book, and you say, quote, moving from the simplistic what
Uh-huh.
toward the more complicated and more truthful how story of politics is the purpose of the book. So can you
Yeah.
unpack what those two mean for our guys to understand better?
Right. So this gets to, again, the importance of saying, I am not saying Christians should not be political. I'm saying Christians shouldn't have the highest allegiance to their partisan loyalties, because politics is actually involves a lot of things. And I'm dividing into two categories: the what of politics and the how of politics. So the what of politics would be, hey, what is the right policy on immigration, on the border, on taxes, on sexuality, gender, you name it, right? It's a what. This is what government should do, right? And then it's like, well, what party is the best one to carry out that vision of the what of government should do? And then what should my vote be for a candidate that advances all of that, all of those what's, okay? Now, that's legitimate, and it is a part of politics. I'm not saying that Christians shouldn't care about it or shouldn't have an opinion or a viewpoint on that. But that is not all of what politics is. Politics is also about the how. Again, remember, politics is how do we live together, right? So how do we treat one another when we disagree? How do we hold our own views? How much confidence do we have? How do we talk about each other and so forth? Those are also political issues. They are political behavior. How do you relate to people, especially on the other side? And the point of our book is that Christians have so much reduced politics to the what, which is really where partisan divisions come in. It's the what, partisan animosity is all about the different what's, right? So we've so reduced politics to being a Christian in politics is having either a red what or a blue what, right? We're saying, no, no, no. Jesus is as much and probably more so about the how. How do we relate to one another? And that explains how he could create his party that in which Matthew and Simon, who would have very different what's on politics, could still hang together as his core disciples because they had a shared how. And so let me give you an example. Okay, Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 5, to 7. This would be the core of Jesus' teaching. I just challenge anybody to draw a straight line from Jesus' teaching on the Sermon on the Mount to a specific what on border, on the immigration, on tax policy, on any number of controversial issues. Which Supreme Court justices should we appoint? Like you can't draw a straight line. Now you can try to make some connections, and that's legitimate to do so. But those lines that you draw from Jesus' clear words in the Sermon on the Mount to a current day what of politics, it's going to be a very convoluted line. You have to make a lot of moves. It's going to be fuzzy. And here's what also, Jim, other Christians will draw that line differently. And they're going to have good reasons for drawing those lines differently. Okay. So you can do it, but you just have to acknowledge it's fuzzy. And it's going to be contested. Now on the how, Jesus has some very clear teachings that has immediate ramifications for our political behavior on the how. Matthew 5:7, show mercy to one another. 5:9, make peace. You're blessed are the peacemakers, right? 5:21 and 22, refrain from calling each other raka, fool, moron, you idiot, right?
That never happens in politics. Come on.
Right. Yeah, right. Because our politics are full of mercy, full of peacemaking.
Now hold on, Curtis. Let me stop you here. So we're talking right now to Christians who get angry and say things that So now we're talking to Christian guys. So Christian guys showing mercy, making peace, refraining from mocking. You've got 3 more on your list in your book. Why don't you go through those? But guys,
sure. Just
how
real
are
quick,
you doing this, guys?
25, Jesus says, hey, prioritize reconciliation over winning your dispute, right? So if you're on your way to court to win a dispute and you realize, oh, wait, my brother has something against him, go reconcile first, right? So reconciliation more important than winning, right? Avoid sexual scandals, right? And avoid endorsing anything with sexual scandals. 5:27 to 30, 5:33 to 37, tell the truth, including telling the truth about your own side. And, right? So all of these things now, I think Christians, citizens, Americans in general, but Christians in particular, are tempted to violate all of those hows in order to win on the what. Don't show mercy. That means showing weakness when we could lose if you show weakness. Don't make peace. We got to defeat them. Own the libs or own the MAGA, right? Call them names, right? Call them our modern day equivalent of Raqqa, you fool. We're all willing to violate these very clear commandments of Jesus on the how in order to win on the what. When the what is more fuzzy, contested, and like I said, where we have a straight, uncontestable line on the Jesus how just from the Sermon on the Mount. So our book is trying to get Christians to say our politics have to be characterized by faithfulness and obedience to Jesus on the how. not giving up caring about the what, but let's not sacrifice what is clear, what is emphasized by Jesus on the how, just in order to think we can gain an edge over our opponents on the what, right? We're not going to be loving our neighbors if we do that. And so the Sermon on the Mount is one way of saying, hey, what does it mean to love your neighbor as including in your political behavior? Here's how you do it. Prioritize that. And what I have found, Jim, if Christians, especially Christians, if they can submit themselves on the left and the right to the Jesus how on the politics, you can actually tolerate and hold and accept and even learn from differences on the what, because you have a shared commitment to Jesus that knows, hey, no matter what, we're going to be merciful to one another. We're not going to be telling the truth. We're not going to mock one another. We're going to prioritize our relationships over winning.
You know, it comes down to Philippians 3:20 to me. We are citizens of heaven. I think you said the word citizen. I thought, yeah, he's hit. I really love this discussion because the majority of our followers probably fall on one side of the fence.
Uh-huh.
And I think to the chagrin of Jesus sometimes that we allow it to control us, because ultimately as believers we're a part of God's kingdom, God's party, not any earthly party, and that has to, forgive the pun here, trump all other things.
That's right.
It has
100%.
to be a priority. So you mentioned something earlier. You talked about the big sort. And
Yeah.
and early on in your book, you had us make a list, right? I read the whole book, right? I read the book online, and I've got the one from my library right here. And so,
Yeah.
but you had us do something I thought was really powerful. You said, "Hey, I want you to make a list. Who are the disappeared ones from your life?" So can you, we just kind of save that for the middle of the podcast so the guys have to pull over and start, yelling at me on the TV, the radio here. So what are the disappeared ones? Where did this phrase come from? What country, where did this come from? Tell the story, and then
Yeah.
let's call these guys out. They love being called out because they want to be called up, right? So let's ask the question. So why don't you
Yeah.
unpack this for us?
Yeah, so this is an exercise we have people do in the book and also in the online course that we have, because the after party is a book and it's also a course that you can go through in small groups with your men's group, your men's Bible study and so forth. So check out at after-party.org. So you can do it as a book or as a course. But in both formats, we have them do this exercise where we make a list of who has disappeared from your life because of political differences, and just list them who they are. And then actually think about those people, think about what's been lost because those people have been disappeared from your life. Think about what you originally valued in that person that now has been lost because of political differences. And I think it's important for us to do that because we know instinctively Jesus cares about relationships. And we need to realize how much our partisan allegiances has cost us in these disappeared relationships. And that term, the disappeared ones, comes from Argentina. It comes from a era in politics where the social division got so bad it caused political violence between the two sides. And that's when it gets super tragic, right? It's like, and I think we're in danger as a country of heading that because we have so socially disappeared one another. We are more ready to entertain physically disappearing one another. The amount of American citizens, including Christians, who have responded to poll surveys that say, is violence justified to resolve political differences? That is growing rapidly, the number of people, right? So think about, let's call out the men. You said call out the men, right? If we as men succumb to using our manly energies, physicality, righteous use of force for unrighteous means, to actually cancel other people, like from life, to cause disappearance that's going to be a horrible tragedy, right? That is a deformation of what it means to be a man, is when we are taking life or causing injury to life in order to cancel other people's political differences. Now, I imagine the vast majority of your listeners would say, "Oh, I would never do that." But we have to realize we're on a path right now. We're just being drawn further and further down the path because once you start being unable to imagine a relationship, a human person who thinks differently than you and politically, and still you love them, you're in a relationship with them, you're their brother, and that when you start unable to even imagine it, you can't even think about anybody in your life. You just start dehumanizing the other side. And
Mm-hmm.
that's a key next step to thinking that violence against the other side is justified.
Well, and statistics are showing us more and more people today are in favor of violence, political violence,
Yeah,
right? That's
it's
in your
really
book.
scary. Yeah,
And it's, you made a comment to the men, and I appreciate it. Here's the other thing too: is if we're prioritizing our partisan viewpoints ahead of our kingdom and biblical truth, we are influencing the generation below us, i.e., our
that's
children,
that's right.
to make that a higher value
Yeah,
than Jesus. And it's
yeah.
hard enough already to raise up godly children in a secular world. But this really puts a little bit more of a burden on things when they're having to
Yeah,
navigate around this as well, right? It's kind of like sports, the sports parents or the political parents or the
yeah,
music
that's
parents.
right.
These kids get immersed in something, and we're doing damage to the next generation.
That's right. That's right. And we have to protect them. And let me just say a word to your men out there, because I really do believe a genuinely God reflecting characteristic of men that we are called to is to show courage. Now, it doesn't mean women don't show courage as well, but there's a kind of manly courage that I think men especially are show. And I think it is the courage to stand up against the crowd, to stand up against the pressures of the world. That's real courage, right? It does not take courage to join the mob. It does not take courage to do and think what everybody else around you is thinking and doing. Courage is required to say, no, I'm going to stand against the pressures of my group or my era, and so forth. And let's face it, it does not take any courage for a leftist man to spout leftist slogans. And it doesn't take any courage for a right-leaning man to spout right-wing courage when you're surrounded by everybody who agrees with you. Like, you're just winning points. You're just like, yeah, right on either side. That's not courage. Courage is the Sermon on the Mount. Courage is saying, you know what? We are not going to call the other side idiots, morons, raka, fool, right? That's not honoring to Jesus. Try doing that to a crowd of partisan loyalists, either on the left or the right. Be that Christian who's going to call out your own tribe, left or right, and say, no, we're not, as Christians, we don't do that. We don't subscribe to that. How? That takes courage. That takes actually manly courage to do that.
That's so good. I'm so glad you said that, man, because I've got this 90% rule, Curtis. Maybe it's because I'm from California now. I'm up here in Northern Oregon, but I have found in my life 90% of the people that I'm surrounded by do not follow my view of Jesus.
Mhm.
It's probably higher than that, right? Probably 95. So I've already got this massive group of people who I'm surrounded by who don't believe what I believe or practice it. But then when I start doing this partisan thing, now I've got 50 on one side, 50 on the other. Well,
That's right.
I've got a 50% chance they're going to be on my partisan side. Well, that's more gutless than courageous.
Yeah.
So the courageous man is the one who says, I'm going to stand in the middle of a circle where I'm the only one out of 100. There's a couple of us, and I'm
Yeah.
going to stand for Team Jesus. And
That's right.
to me, that's true courage. And it's funny. I do a lot of speaking and writing, and one of the things I'm telling guys, because there's a verse in the Bible that it happens in the Old Testament, it happens in the New Testament, it happens in the book of Acts, and Matthew 13 verse 15, Jesus mentions that he talks about you hardly hear with your ears, and you have closed your eyes. Therefore, I would turn and heal you. He talks about the callous hearts. And what we share with the guys is, guys, listen, what are the things that you're looking at and listening to that are really, really hurting you? And yes, pornography is not something you want to look at. But the things that you're walking away with from your CNN or your
Yeah.
Newsmax, they're
It's
ruining
political
you.
pornography, Jim. It's
They're
political
I'm
pornography.
telling you what,
Yeah,
what I,
yeah.
I love to push back is I tell these guys, hey man, if I want to watch the WWE, I will. If I want to, and that's what Fox News or Newsmax or CNN or
Yeah.
NBC. There's a lot of, it's entertaining. It's
Yeah.
just not truth. And as a Christian guy, we want truth. Okay, do you want to hear my favorite quote in your book?
Go for it.
Okay, this is my favorite quote in your book, and I'm just going to let you unpack it. I know we're saying things over and over again, but I'm a guy, and our audience is mostly men, and we need to hear this over and over again. Here's what you said in your book: to follow Jesus, we move towards the how. Here's the key part I love: practice over policy, relationships over party, spiritual values over ideology, the how over the what. This is the big shift that happens in the Jesus party. So you talk about the big sort, and now you're moving to the big shift. Can you explain this? I just love how we've got to put practices over policy, relationships over party, spiritual values over ideology. Talk about this big shift.
Well, I think this shift happens in community. It happens with other men. Like this is not something you do alone. It's very hard to do alone. And this is actually why I encourage men to read the book together or go through the course, video course together, because this shift takes courage, right? Because the world is taking us down. Everything is about policy. Everything is about party. Everything is about who you vote for, which politician, which ideology. And so to shift towards spiritual formation, relationships, practices, all this, it takes courage and it takes community. We have to do this together with one another. And it's best when we can also do that with people who think differently than us. This is why in our book, we lead people to maybe consider taking steps to actually work this out in a relationship with one person that is on your list of disappeared ones, right? Like, can you actually prioritize a spiritual formation process that's like, I'm going to prioritize peacemaking and relationship over owning this person or being mad at this person because of their political views. And so this is the path of discipleship, the how over the what, not meaning you stop caring about the what of politics, but we need to care more about the Jesus how of politics. Jim, I want to say one more thing about why this is a good move, why you should want to do this, okay? Not just the right thing to do, but the good thing to do. Because I think ultimately we want to be people of hope. And right, we want to and we want to be men who are calling our future, our children, our generations to have a hopeful view of the future versus a despairing view of the future, right? So what's the Christian hope that we call for? Where is that hope for? Well, it's clear that in Scripture, the hope for the repair and restoration of all things that's broken happens in one political historical moment. And you know what? It's not an election. It's not an election when that happens. It's when the king returns, when Jesus returns to restore all things and repair all things. And we're all going to be surprised at what that looks like. Red and left is like, wait, would that involve that? It's like, nobody's got the answer because the Jesus party is not the Republican Party or the Democratic Party. So, and that moment when Jesus returns as the king, that is described as a party in the scripture, right? That is in Revelation, the wedding feast of the Lamb when Jesus returns, or Isaiah 50 to 66, when it's described as the feast on Mount Zion, the great feast when the king returns. And so that's what we hope for. And that's what we have to understand. Everything that we think as men is wrong with this world, and there are many things that are wrong with this world, none of them are going to be decisively, finally fixed until the king returns. That's the moment. That party is when that is fixed. All other claims by Republican or Democratic parties, they are at best little signs or point posts, shadows of that final party. So do not put your hopes that if your party wins, then everything that's broken in this world will be made right. That's a false promise. That's called idolatry. Okay, to trust in a human construct for something that only God will do. And so this is why the shift from the what to the how is so important, because the how ultimately says, you know what, all these things that are wrong in the what, that is the only how that's going to fix that is the how of Jesus, when Jesus returns with his kingdom. And so all of our disputes on this sort of partisan levels, we can have them. It's fine to talk about them, but we're not talking about things that are going to fix the world decisively and finally, right? All to that, we've got to point to the return of Jesus. And this is, again, why prioritizing the how of relationships is so important, because when we relate to another person who thinks differently than us on the what of politics, especially as brothers in Christ, when we do that, like when you and I are talking, like, Jim, we probably disagree on a bunch of what's on politics. It's not even important to me to even surface that, but we probably do, right? But by us, you and I, having as two men, having this conversation and talking about Jesus in the way we are, and together agreeing, you know what, whatever we agree, well, even if we disagree on what's going to fix things temporarily, we know the only permanent fix is the return of Jesus. That's when we proclaim the gospel. By us being able to talk in this way and agree on that, we are, by definition, we are proclaiming the good news of Jesus, saying there is going to be a day when everything that's broken, everything that you think is wrong in this world is going to get fixed. And that day is coming. It
Mm-hmm.
isn't here, and it's not going to get ushered in by an election result.
Nope.
It's going to get ushered in by the return of Jesus.
Man, you're preaching to the choir, man. Literally, like you're preaching, and I'm going, amen to that. You know, I want to go back and say something. If you have a disappeared one in your life, if you have somebody that you canceled out of your life, man, you know, you have a biblical responsibility to make that right. So whether you did it passively or whether you had a falling out, man, you have a biblical responsibility to take care of that relationship. So you spent a lot of talk on hope just now, but hope is one side of the coin. Let me read a quote from your book. You said this: "You may think you have the absolutely correct take on immigration, abortion, police violence, support for Israel, gay rights, or any other topic. But if you are showing up in conversations without humility and without a fundamental motivation to serve everyone touched by that topic in Jesus' evaluation, you have missed the boat." So let's talk about humility's role in hope. You know, we often forget, guys, that God has called us to steward the bodies he gave us so that we'll be ready, healthy, and spiritually dangerous to fight the good fight. That's why we're so excited to partner with Mountain Tough Fitness Lab. Join me on my journey by going to mountaintough.com and getting your free 6-week trial when you type in the code ARENA30. You won't be disappointed. Stay dangerous. So let's talk about humility's role in hope.
Yeah. They're the two big values we are calling people to, hope and humility. And in fact, we have a really fun quiz we ask people to take that sort of plots you where you are in hope and humility and gives you a way to identify yourself with a profile. And we can talk about that.
Which is actually a major part of the book.
Yeah, it is a major part of the book, right? Like where you are in hope and humility defines where you are on the path to discipleship, because the disciple is the one who's high in hope and high in humility, right? The disciple of Jesus. And I've talked about hope, like our ultimate hope is in the return of Jesus to fix everything and what's wrong in the world. And the other coin of that is humility, which means if we believe that the ultimate hope is still to come in the future, right, in Jesus' return, that means we've got to be very humble about our ability to think that in the here and now, in the right now, before Jesus returns, that we've got some lock on the ultimate truth, on the ultimate solution to social problems, right? Because our hope is in Jesus, which is to come in the future. That means if we're living here now, by definition, we've got to be humble because we don't see clearly. We see through a mirror darkly. We, as Paul says, like we don't have all the answers. We can try. It doesn't mean we can't try to think, hey, what's the better picture of reality? But to think we are 100% right, the other person is 100% wrong, we know for sure, that is arrogance. That is arrogance because we don't live in that day of final revelation of truth that only happens when Jesus comes. We're now anticipating that. And if we believe that it is true, that we live in the hope of a future return of our King, any political statement, position we take now, which again, we can take them, has to be colored with a deep humility that entertains the possibility I may have some of it wrong, a lot of it wrong, maybe even all of it wrong. It's possible. And that means the other person may have some of it right, or part of it right, or some portion of that. And if you can enter a conversation in a relationship when you're talking about the what of politics that is guided by the how of humility, it changes everything. It changes everything because you can talk like as brothers who are like, here's what I think, but I could be wrong. Tell me what you think. Maybe I can learn from something from it. That's a totally different relationship and a totally different conversation.
Well, that's the tension, right? We live in as believers. We live in the now and not yet tension, right? We have hope now in something that is not yet. And there's a tension there, but you said something towards the end of your book, and you've been saying it throughout, but you haven't actually said it. And I think it comes down to this. I'll just read it to you because I just like quoting you instead. This book has been demonstrating that following Jesus means leaving behind the us versus them mindset. The world will inevitably subject you to political loyalty tests. So let's talk about this. That, when you talk about disappeared ones, the big sort, it really comes down to when I look at a person, and I have to confess, I've done this.
Yeah, me too.
I'm just telling you I have.
Yeah, me
this
too.
us versus them.
Yeah.
How is this dangerous in the kingdom?
Yeah, because the whole message of the gospel is there's an us. There is one us gathered around the
Oh,
cross. Galatians
yes.
3:28, right? Like neither Greek nor Jew, free or slave. And it's this idea that Jesus has reconciled all of the divisions in the world, all of the us versus them, right? This is why all the different formulations are Scythian versus Greek, Jew versus Gentile, like all of the first century us versus them. The Gospels proclaim Jesus has won over that. And the winning of an us versus them is not one side wins. It's that Jesus in the cross and his death and resurrection has created one us gathered around him in obedience and faithfulness to Jesus. So if the church is divided in a us versus them of the world, if we've got a red church and a blue church, a Democrat church and a Republican church, we are contradicting the Jesus gospel, the Jesus proclamation that in the cross, he's created one us around him, right? So this is why the us versus them, when we find ourselves slipping into the mentality and thinking, oh yeah, like just that of an us versus them mentality, we're betraying the gospel.
Will you go back real quick and just give a summary of the four categories on the humility hope scale? The
Yeah,
combatant. I think this is good for us, our guys, to go, wow, I'm definitely in this realm.
yeah.
So talk to us
So
about
we
that.
give yeah. So like I said, we first sort of show, which I hope people listening can realize why hope and humility are such core values, core commitments of a disciple of Jesus, right? So if you put hope and humility on an X and Y axis, and you end up with four quadrants, right? So on the high humility, high hope quadrant, that's the disciple. The disciple is like, they're high in humility. That's why they're a disciple. A disciple is like, I'm a learner. I need to learn. I don't know everything.
Hmm.
So I'm high in humility. But a disciple is somebody who says, I found the master. I found the rabbi. So I'm
Yes.
hopeful. I can learn, right? So I'm high in hope. Now, now think about somebody who is high in hope but low in humility. We call that person the combatant. They're hopeful. That's why they're fighting. They think they can win, but they think they're right. They think they're 100% right, and their enemy, the them, is 100% wrong. So they're high in hope, low in humility. They're the combatant. You go to the mirror image of that, and you think about somebody who is high in humility. Like, I don't know all the answers. I don't know everything, but I'm also low in hope. That person is the exhausted. They're the person who's like, I don't know everything, but one thing I do know is it's hopeless. Right? Like it's just like I'm out. I'm exhausted. Right? So and that characterizes a lot of people also. Right? And then there's the cynical who is actually low in hope and low in humility. And actually, that's me. That would characterize my profile because I feel like I'm checking out. I don't even want to have anything to do with politics in the world because I'm so cynical about all that. And the posture of cynicism is somebody that says, you know what, it's all hopeless. So I'm low in hope, but you know what? I'm 100% right. Everything's hopeless. I know it. I know it better than everybody else. So I'm low in humility as well. So these are the three big profiles of combatant, exhausted, and cynical. And I think a lot of us, if when we take this quiz, and it's been shown to be helpful, it's helpful for us to locate which one of us are we, right? Because we may be different in that, but we then can come together around a common pursuit to become a disciple, to grow either our hope or humility, or if you're like me, a cynic, a need to grow both. And one of the reasons I think that's helpful is because if you anchor or you're thinking about politics solely on the what, then you get together and you take a quiz, and it's like, are you progressive or are you conservative? Are you right? And this is a way to actually categorize us or kind of understand us, profile us in a different way than on the what of politics, but rather on the how of politics. And then together, because you could be a Republican exhausted and a Democratic exhausted. You can be a Republican combatant and a Democrat combatant, and you can find unity. Oh, yeah, you too. You're also a combatant. You're also an exhausted. What does it mean for us then together to grow together towards being a disciple?
Yeah, it's funny. I'm flipping through your book right now, looking for the graph. I can't
Yeah,
find it, but I would definitely put myself in the cynical category.
yeah,
And I think part of
for
it is I'm
sure.
so busy calling every people out on their viewpoints, I kind of have become a cynic, and there's an arrogance to it. So that's been really convicting for
Yeah,
me. So
it's on
thanks.
page 72, by the way. So
72. Okay,
you
I was
want to
flipping
check.
through it,
Yeah.
trying not to be rude. Well, let's end with this one statement here, and I thought this is really interesting. This is something Biblically, I never knew this or I never thought of it. And you said this. You said Roman. It's about Jesus period, not Jesus plus here. You said Roman crucifixion was reserved for political crimes alone. And the gospel narratives consistently narrate the crucifixion to show that it was not one individual or personal act that crucified Jesus. So you're saying he was crucified as a political criminal. Talk to us about that.
Well, what's interesting is that he was crucified as a political criminal, but actually, like that, what he wasn't actually trying to articulate a vision in which one side was supposed to win, right? So again, if you think of Rome on one side and Jewish nationalism, the zealots, tax collectors, Jesus was saying, "No, I've got a third way."
I
And
am a
yet,
king. I am a
I
king.
am a king. Yes, right. Like I'm not. My politics are not of this world. Not of this world. But I mean, not the ways you've constructed the lines of us versus them. And for that, he was crucified. He was crucified by both sides, right? The Pharisees and the temple establishment, they were like actually part of the Jewish nationalism cause, right? Pharisees were actually like allied with the Zealots. They went along with the crucifixion, and asked Rome to do it, which just goes to show you how Jesus is like, I'm not playing your game, right? And that so infuriates both sides that they actually conspire together to kill Jesus because they're willing to they're more committed to the us versus them ruling the day that they're willing to actually cooperate with the other side to get rid of Jesus because Jesus threatens that very construct of the world that is us versus them. That's something that we should really think seriously about. Like, are we so tied to, so committed to an us versus them, right versus left, whatever side you're on? We're so committed to that like we'd rather have that war, that culture war continue rather than submit to Jesus. Because that's what ultimately happened in first century Israel, that both sides of that partisan divide over the what of politics, they ultimately decided we want to get rid of Jesus more, so much so that we're actually even willing to cooperate with the other side in getting rid of Jesus.
But you know what's even more powerful than that, Curtis? And I mean, this is, Second Timothy 3:12 says, for the godly in Christ will be crucified. And you know what's really, will be persecuted. I'm sorry, for the godly in Christ
right?
will be
Yeah,
persecuted.
but yes,
What's
that's right.
interesting to me is the question for our guys listening is, are you willing to stand for Jesus to a degree that you will be crucified figuratively or literally by both parties? I mean, really, because our message is offensive to both sides, right?
That's right. That's right.
And that is
named it exactly, Jim. And because that was what happened to Jesus, right?
That's why I love that point. I'm like, dang, he ended with a crescendo there. That was awesome. Well, hey, Curtis, I am so glad you came on our show. We have needed to hear this message for the last 4 or 5 years, 15 years, according to what you were saying. Yeah. How can guys get a hold of your book? And if they want to start a small group, give us the next step here.
Well, so you can go to any of your, Amazon or wherever you get the book. It's The After Party by Curtis Chang and Nancy French. You can get the book, but also you go to after-party.org. That's after-party.org. And you can take the video version of the course and do it in conjunction with the book if you want. Go through it with your men's group, your small group, your Bible study, and so forth. It's completely free. The course is free. The book you got to pay for because there's a publisher, but the course is free. And I would encourage you to check it out both. And one quick note, we've got a set of worship songs coming out in the next few months called Songs for the After Party that are actually worship songs that embody the Jesus After Party message.
I appreciate that. Well, the After Party, I read this book in a day. It's about 160 pages, so it's an easy read, guys, if you're intimidated by books. So grab this, and don't have your red church or your blue church have a Bible study. Go mix it up a little bit. Have some knocked out dragouts as you're discussing the hows over the what. So, hey, Curtis, thanks so much for coming on the show today. God bless you, man, and your mission. I hope you don't get crucified too hard.
Oh, thank you, Jim.
Actually, I probably should say I hope you do.
So we're going to do it together, you and me, man.
Oh, yeah. Well, I shouldn't say I hope you don't. I should probably say I hope you do.
No, hey, listen, your mission, your ministry to call men to the higher standard, the higher call of Jesus, so needed in the world today. And if I can do anything to be a brother to you and support your ministry, don't hesitate to reach out.
Hey, have a great day, man. Thanks for coming on the show.
All right. Take care. Bye-bye.
Men, if you're enjoying our podcast and you're not yet a subscriber, make sure you go and subscribe. Our subscribers tripled last year. We're excited to see that triple or quadruple again. Man, we are excited to have you plugged in to Men in the Arena podcast. Until next time, feel the wet sand on the arena floor. Hear the deafening roar of the crowd. Taste the sweetness of victory. Smell the stench of battle. Get in the game. Get dirty. Grind it out. Build bridges. And be a man.